was an ordinary Saturday morning, and I was on my way to the local convenience store, the one I passed every day after school. It wasn't far, just a couple of blocks down the street. I always liked going there because it had that old-school charm. Dim lights, the smell of fresh bread and snacks in the air, and the ever-familiar chime of the doorbell ringing every time someone walked in. But that morning, something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it yet, but I had this strange sense that today wasn't going to be like the others. I walked through the entrance with my backpack slung over one shoulder, feeling the usual warmth and comfort the store always gave me. I glanced around, taking in the rows of neatly arranged shelves filled with snacks, drinks, and other goodies. I didn't need anything specific today, just wanted to grab a bag of chips and maybe a drink for the walk home. As I made my way down the snack aisle, I caught sight of a few kids I knew from school, chatting and laughing, making jokes about something that happened in class. I smiled to myself, remembering how good it felt to have friends to joke with. But then I noticed her, the store clerk. I had seen her a few times before, but this time something seemed off. She was standing behind the counter, her gaze cold and unwelcoming. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was just having a bad day. But when I approached the counter to pay for my snacks, I could feel her eyes on me. Her expression was stiff, like she didn't want to be there, and her lips were tightly pressed together as if she were forcing herself to smile. It was unsettling, but I shrugged it off, hoping it was just me overthinking things. "Hi, can I get these, please?" I asked, placing the chips and drink on the counter. She didn't respond right away, just stared at me for a moment, almost as if she was sizing me up. I felt my palms start to sweat. This wasn't like the usual exchanges I'd had with the other clerks. They were always friendly, quick to make small talk or ask how my day was going. But with her there was nothing. No greeting, no pleasantries, just cold silence. Finally, she spoke, but her words caught me off guard. "Cash or card?" she muttered in a tone that was anything but friendly. Her voice was flat, as though she couldn't care less about my purchase. I felt an odd tension in the air, something heavy and uncomfortable, but I didn't know what to do. I handed her my card, trying to ignore the feeling that something was off. But as I did, I saw her eyes flicker to the card and then back to me. There was a slight hesitation, and then, to my surprise, she let out a small, almost inaudible scoff. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but something inside me told me to pay attention. Her expression didn't change. If anything, it grew more rigid as she slid the card through the reader. I tried to smile, but she didn't return it. The atmosphere felt like it was closing in on me, and I started to feel more and more uneasy. Why was she acting like this? I had been to this store countless times before, and I had never experienced anything like this. I stood there, waiting for the transaction to go through, my mind racing. Was I overreacting? Maybe she was just having a bad day. Maybe she was tired or stressed. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just that. There was something more, something beneath the surface. I felt like I was being judged, treated differently for something I couldn't even understand. Just then, the beep of the register snapped me out of my thoughts. The transaction was complete, and I grabbed my bag, trying to ignore the lingering tension. I gave her a quick, polite thanks and turned to leave, but as I did, I couldn't help but feel like I had just been made to feel small. Like I didn't belong in that store, or maybe even in that town. It was a feeling I had never experienced before, and I couldn't shake it as I walked out the door. I was halfway down the street when I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. What had just happened? Why had she acted that way? And why did I feel like she had somehow made it personal? I glanced over my shoulder, but the store was already out of sight. I didn't want to go back, didn't want to deal with whatever that was. but I had to, right? I had to know if it was just me, or if there was something else going on. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of something that would shake me to my core, something I could never have prepared for. The next day, I decided to return to the store. I told myself that I had overthought things the previous day, and maybe the clerk was just having an off moment. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, especially about something that might have been nothing, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling from yesterday, the way she looked at me, how uncomfortable it had made me. I convinced myself that I should just go back, grab what I needed, and leave. Keep it simple, like I always did. I walked down the street again, trying to calm the unease that had taken over me. The air felt heavier today, like it was thick with tension, but I couldn't figure out why. When I reached the store, I hesitated for just a moment before pushing open the door. The familiar chime rang out as I stepped inside, but this time I didn't feel the usual sense of comfort. The store, with its rows of bright snacks and shelves stacked with drinks, didn't seem as welcoming as it had before. I could see the same clerk behind the counter again. Her gaze was fixed on something, but as soon as she heard the door open, she glanced up. Our eyes met briefly, and I felt a wave of discomfort wash over me. There was no smile, no friendly greeting, just that cold, appraising look. I tried to ignore it as best as I could. This time, I wasn't going to let her make me feel out of place. I wasn't going to let her affect me. I grabbed a couple of items off the shelf, some chips, a soda, and a candy bar. Simple, easy things. As I walked down the aisles, I noticed a few other customers milling about, but I kept my focus on what I had in my hands. I wasn't here to make a scene or create any drama. I just wanted to get what I needed and leave. But as I made my way toward the counter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When I approached the register, I tried to make eye contact with her, but she didn't look up right away. She continued to fiddle with something on the counter, her hands moving methodically as if she were avoiding acknowledging me. I cleared my throat softly, hoping to get her attention. She finally looked up, and there it was again. The coldness in her eyes. She didn't greet me or even ask how my day was. Instead, she just stared at me, as if I were the last person she wanted to deal with. "Is that all?" she asked, her voice flat and uninterested. I nodded, placing the items on the counter. There was no warmth in her voice, no sign of kindness or hospitality. I tried to keep it casual, but I could feel myself starting to tense up. She scanned the items with a sharp motion, but when she reached the candy bar, she paused. Her eyes flickered to the barcode, then back to me, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something like disdain in her gaze. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. I wasn't sure why, but I felt the urge to speak up, to say something, anything. "I was here yesterday," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think you were the one helping me." Her eyes didn't meet mine as she continued scanning the items. "I remember," she said, her tone clipped. It was the way she said it that made me feel like I wasn't welcome, like she was purposefully being cold. I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just having a rough time. The transaction was moving slowly, and the silence between us grew thicker with every passing second. I felt my hands beginning to sweat as the tension in the air started to feel unbearable. I shifted on my feet, unsure of what to do. Should I say something? Should I just ignore it and leave? Before I could make up my mind, I noticed something strange. A man came in from the door behind the counter. He was a regular customer, someone I had seen in the store a few times before. He was tall, well-dressed, and always greeted the clerk with a big smile. The clerk's demeanor immediately shifted. She straightened up, flashed him a smile and greeted him like she hadn't done for me. "Hey, Greg," she said, her voice suddenly warmer, more friendly. "What can I get for you today?" I couldn't help but notice the stark difference in how she treated him compared to me. It was like night and day. She was suddenly animated, engaging, and kind to him, but to me, she had been nothing but cold and distant. I felt a pang of something deep in my chest. Embarrassment, frustration, anger. I wasn't sure, but I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just a bad day for her. There was something personal about the way she treated me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had nothing to do with me being a customer or a regular. I glanced down at the counter, trying to avoid eye contact, but I couldn't stop myself from listening to their conversation. Greg was talking about the weather, how he had just come back from a trip, and the clerk was responding with enthusiasm. There was even some small talk about his family. Meanwhile, I stood there, feeling invisible. The only sound was the rustling of the bags as the clerk packed his items. When she finished with Greg, she turned back to me without a word. She didn't even offer to help with my items. The discomfort in the air had become so palpable that I almost didn't want to be there anymore. But I had already gone this far. I had to get out of there without making a scene. I handed her my card, trying to keep my composure, but it felt like everything about her, her coldness, her dismissal, was aimed directly at me. Her fingers brushed against mine as she took the card, and I felt a brief, electric jolt of tension. She didn't look at me when she processed the payment. She didn't even bother to say, "Thank you." There was nothing. As I grabbed my items and turned to leave, the doorbell chimed again, and the store felt smaller, darker somehow. The moment I stepped outside, I could breathe again. But the discomfort, the sting of being treated differently, lingered. I walked quickly down the street, my mind racing. Why had she treated me like that? What had I done to deserve it? I kept asking myself if I was imagining things, but the memory of her cold eyes, the way she had dismissed me in front of Greg, was too vivid to ignore. It wasn't just a bad encounter, it felt personal. It felt like something deeper, but I had no idea yet just how deep it would go. The days that followed felt like they dragged on in slow motion. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the store. Every time I walked past it, my heart would race, and I'd catch myself glancing toward the door as if expecting to see the clerk again, still giving me that cold stare. I tried to convince myself it was just a misunderstanding, that it didn't matter. But it did. It mattered more than I was willing to admit. I told myself it was nothing personal, that she was just having a rough day. People have bad days, right? But then I began to notice something strange. Every time I went by the store, I would see her in there. And each time, her eyes would flick to me the moment I passed by, as if she was waiting for me to come inside, ready to give me that same chilling look. It was like I was marked in some way, and she had this need to make sure I knew it. I started feeling like I couldn't escape it. I wasn't even shopping, just walking past. But there she was, like a shadow I couldn't shake. It felt like she was watching me, almost as if she knew I was thinking about her. The discomfort I felt had started to creep into other parts of my life, invading moments when I was supposed to be relaxed or focused. One afternoon, after another long day at school, I found myself walking by the store again. My feet moved on their own, as though they had a mind of their own, pulling me in that direction. I had no intention of going in, but I didn't turn away either. Something inside me urged me to face it, to confront whatever strange pull I was feeling. Maybe, just maybe, I would finally get answers. Or maybe I was just overreacting. I wasn't sure anymore. As I approached, I saw the store clerk through the window. She was standing behind the counter, her back turned to the door, fiddling with something on the shelf. For a brief second, I considered turning around and walking away, but I couldn't. Something about her made me feel like I needed to know what she was really about. Why did she treat me the way she did? I pushed open the door again. The familiar chime rang out, louder this time. She didn't immediately notice me. I stood there for a moment, scanning the aisles, trying to act casual, but my eyes kept drifting back to her. I had to get through this. I wasn't going to let her intimidate me anymore. When she finally noticed me standing there, she didn't look shocked or surprised. In fact, she looked almost resigned, as though she knew I would come back. Her eyes met mine briefly before she returned to her work behind the counter. Her movements were quick, but stiff, robotic even. I grabbed a few things off the shelf, pretending to be absorbed in the items in front of me. My mind, however, was racing. Was I imagining all of this, or was she intentionally ignoring me, making it known that I wasn't welcome in her store? The thought made my stomach turn, but I forced myself to calm down. I wasn't going to give in to fear. As I walked toward the counter to check out, I noticed something strange. The store was quieter than usual. The other customers who had been in there earlier were gone, leaving just the two of us alone. The lights above flickered slightly, casting an eerie glow on the shelves and aisles. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it seemed like the air in the room had changed. It was thick, heavy, with something unspoken. She didn't greet me when I approached. She didn't ask if I found everything I needed, nothing at all. She just stood there, staring at me for a moment, and I swore I saw a hint of something dark in her eyes, something that felt like malice. It was quick, just a flash, but it was enough to make me pause. "Is that all?" she asked, her voice as cold as it had been the first time. I nodded, trying to keep my composure. My heart pounded in my chest as I placed my items on the counter. I tried to keep my focus, but her stare was like a weight, pressing down on me. Her hands moved slowly, almost deliberately as she rang up my items. Each beep of the scanner echoed in the silence of the store, and I could feel the tension between us building with every passing second. "Cash or card?" she asked flatly, never breaking eye contact. "Card?" I answered, my voice a little unsteady. I handed it to her, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I wanted to say something, to ask her why she was treating me like this, but the words didn't come. It was like I was paralyzed, stuck in this moment, unable to break free. Her fingers brushed against mine as she took my card. The touch was brief, but it sent a chill down my spine. There was something about the way she handled everything, so deliberate, so controlled, that made me feel like she was toying with me. Like she knew something I didn't. The transaction seemed to drag on forever. She took her time, scanning the card, processing the payment, and bagging my items. All the while, her gaze never left mine. It was as if she was waiting for something, waiting for me to react, to do something. The tension was unbearable, like we were both trapped in this strange, unspoken battle. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she handed me the bag. Her fingers brushed mine once more, but this time, I didn't feel cold. I felt the weight of her gaze pressing into me, as if she were daring me to challenge her. I took the bag quickly, turning to leave, but as I made my way to the door, I heard her voice again. "Don't come back," she said, her words low and deliberate. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a knot tighten in my chest. The air around me felt even thicker, suffocating. I turned back slowly, and she was staring at me, her face expressionless. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't angry, but there was something chilling in her tone that sent a shiver down my spine. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't sure if I had heard her correctly. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just looked at me for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. Then, without another word, she turned away and went back to what she had been doing before. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. My mind was racing, but nothing made sense. Why would she say that to me? What had I done to deserve that? I quickly exited the store, my heart still racing in my chest. The door chime echoed behind me as I stepped outside into the cool air, but it didn't bring the relief it usually did. Instead, it felt like I had just stepped out of some kind of nightmare. I didn't know what I had just witnessed, but I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. And I had no idea just how far this was going to go. The following day, I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. Everything seemed wrong. It wasn't just the store or the clerk. It was the way she had looked at me, the way she had spoken to me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't something I could just ignore. I had to talk to my mom. I didn't want to, though. My mom had a way of making everything feel bigger than it was, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to deal with her getting involved. I had already spent so much time convincing myself that it wasn't a big deal, that maybe I was just being overly sensitive. But the more I thought about what had happened at the store, the more I realized that something had to be done. So I told my mom about it. She was concerned, of course. She listened patiently as I explained everything, from the first encounter to the latest one where the clerk had practically threatened me. Her expression darkened as I spoke, and when I finished, she didn't say anything at first. She just stared at me for a moment, her lips pressed tightly together. "You're sure?" she asked finally, her voice steady but with an edge of concern. "You're sure this is what happened?" I nodded. I wasn't imagining it. I knew what I had experienced, but she was right to question it. This wasn't something I could just expect to have understood by anyone else. People had their own ways of seeing the world, and not everyone would interpret what had happened the same way I did. "We're going back there," my mom said, her tone resolute. I froze, my heart racing. "What? No, Mom, you don't have to do that. I don't want to make a scene." But she was already putting on her shoes, the determination in her eyes making it clear that this was happening whether I wanted it to or not. I'm not letting anyone treat my child like that. If something isn't right, we're going to get to the bottom of it. The ride to the store felt long. It wasn't even that far, but with every passing moment the anxiety in my chest grew heavier. I didn't know what my mom planned to do, but I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. What if this made everything worse? What if I was just overreacting and she ended up embarrassing me in front of everyone? When we arrived, I felt a familiar tension rise in me. The store was just as I remembered it. Quiet. Too quiet. I couldn't see the clerk at first, but I could feel her presence, like a shadow hanging over the place. It was as though the entire store was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My mom walked toward the counter and I followed hesitantly behind her. It didn't take long for the clerk to appear. She stepped from the back, her face impassive as always, her eyes flicking to us and then quickly away. She didn't speak. She didn't acknowledge us at all. It was like we were invisible. "Excuse me," my mom said, her voice calm but firm. "Are you the one who helped my daughter yesterday?" The clerk froze for a second, but then her expression hardened. "Yes, I was," she replied shortly. I could feel the tension thickening in the air. My mom didn't flinch, though. She just stood there, her eyes locked onto the clerk. I could see the muscles in my mom's jaw clench. She wasn't backing down. "I need to ask you something," my mom said, her tone more serious now. Why did you treat my daughter the way you did yesterday?" The clerk didn't respond at first. She just blinked at my mom, as if processing the question. Then, after what felt like a long pause, she spoke, her voice flat and defensive. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her gaze drifting away from my mom. I could tell this wasn't the answer my mom had been expecting. She stepped forward slightly, closing the distance between them. "I think you do," she said. "You were rude to her. You made her feel unwelcome in your store, and frankly, I don't appreciate the way you treated my daughter." For a moment, it seemed like the clerk was going to say something else, but she remained silent. My mom didn't back down. The tension in the air seemed to crackle, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Then, unexpectedly, the clerk looked down at the counter, her shoulders slumping slightly. Her hands gripped the edge of the register as she let out a sigh. "I didn't want to do this," she said quietly, her voice low, almost inaudible. "But I had to." My mom raised an eyebrow, but she stayed quiet, waiting for the clerk to continue. The air in the store seemed to hold its breath as the clerk finally looked up, her eyes meeting mine. There was something in her gaze now, something almost apologetic, but it wasn't enough to undo what had already been done. "I've been told to do it," the clerk said, her words coming out in a rush. "I didn't want to, but I didn't have a choice. It's not personal, but the store owner, he told me to keep an eye on certain customers." I could feel my stomach drop. I looked at my mom, who was staring at the clerk with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. My heart pounded in my chest. Keep an eye on certain customers. What does that even mean? My mom's voice was tight with frustration now. "What kind of store is this?" The clerk shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twisting around the counter. She seemed to be weighing her next words carefully, as if unsure how much she could say. Then, finally, she spoke again, her voice trembling. "The owner, he has certain preferences. I didn't know how to handle it. But I had to follow orders," she said, her eyes darting toward the back of the store as if she were worried someone might overhear. "If you're black, he doesn't want you in here. He said it was bad for business. I didn't agree with him, but I didn't have a choice." My mom's face turned pale, her jaw tightening in anger. I felt a cold shiver run through me as everything suddenly clicked into place. The clerk wasn't just being rude. She had been forced to follow the owner's racist orders. "This is unbelievable," my mom said, her voice shaking with rage. "You've been treating my daughter this way because of your boss's racist views?" The clerk nodded slowly, her eyes filled with guilt. "I'm sorry, I didn't want to. I tried to warn you, but he made it clear." My mom didn't say anything for a moment. She just stood there, breathing heavily, her hands clenched into fists. She turned to me, her eyes filled with a quiet fury. "We're leaving," she said, her voice steady. "And we're not coming back." I could barely process what I had just heard. The reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just some random misunderstanding. The owner of this store was openly racist, and the clerk had been forced to play along. It felt like the ground beneath me had shifted, like I was seeing the world through a different lens. As we left the store, I could hear my mom muttering under her breath, too angry to speak clearly, but I knew she was already planning her next steps. This wasn't over. She wasn't going to let this slide. We weren't going to let this slide. And as we walked away, I realized that the world wasn't as simple as I had once thought. Racism didn't always show itself in obvious ways. It could be subtle, insidious, and wrapped up in the most ordinary places. But we were going to fight back. The days following that encounter were filled with a whirlwind of emotions. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head, the feelings of disbelief and hurt, followed by a surge of anger. But what stood out the most to me was my mom's unwavering support. Even when the store clerk had spoken up about being forced into this position, it was my mom who had been there, standing up for me, refusing to let me be treated like I didn't matter. I had never felt so small, yet so strong in my life. I was grateful for her strength, for the example she set every single day, even in the toughest of moments. But more than anything, I was struck by the power of standing together, because that's what my mom and I were doing now. We were standing together, fighting for what was right. My mom didn't just let this slide. She wasn't going to let anyone else treat us like that, especially not in a world that was supposed to be moving forward. She knew that silence wouldn't bring about change. It was only by speaking out, by taking action, that things would start to shift. But it wasn't easy. Even as we walked out of the store, the weight of the situation still hung heavy in the air. The first thing my mom did was document everything. Every detail of the encounter, the date, the time, the names. She wasn't leaving anything to chance. She was determined to make sure this didn't just go unnoticed. We both knew that it would be a battle, that people might question us or try to undermine our experience, but we didn't care. My mom taught me that it wasn't just about me. It was about all the others who had been in similar situations and hadn't spoken up, hadn't had someone in their corner to give them the strength to fight back. I was proud of her, even though I didn't fully understand everything she was doing. She was making calls to advocacy groups, seeking legal advice, and even reaching out to other people who had experienced racism in the same store. It was a slow process, and it felt like a huge uphill battle at times, but she kept pushing forward. There were moments when I felt like giving up, like it wasn't worth all the effort, but my mom was there to remind me that sometimes the most difficult battles were the ones worth fighting for. One day, a few weeks later, we received a letter in the mail. It was from a lawyer. The letter confirmed that the store's owner was under investigation for discrimination, and the clerk had been placed on temporary leave while the situation was being reviewed. My heart pounded as I read the letter aloud to my mom. For a moment, everything seemed surreal. It was one thing to have this experience, but to see that someone was finally taking it seriously, it felt like a victory. Not just for us, but for everyone who had been affected by racism in similar ways. But the most surprising part of it all came when we received an apology letter from the store's management. The apology was formal, professional, and included a promise to retrain staff on discrimination laws and policies. My mom and I both stared at the letter, unsure of what to make of it. Was it enough? Could a simple apology undo the hurt, the damage that had already been done? I didn't think it could. But as my mom sat beside me, I could see the look on her face. She wasn't satisfied with just an apology, but she wasn't done fighting yet either. The thing about my mom was that she never gave up. She didn't just stop with the store owner. She started pushing for more, demanding better practices, stricter policies. She reached out to community leaders and organizations. She didn't want this to be a one-off situation. She wanted change. It was clear to me now, more than ever, her fight wasn't just for us. It was for all the people who had been silenced, ignored, or overlooked. It wasn't about the apology. It was about making sure that this kind of thing didn't happen to anyone else again. She had a fire in her, a passion for justice that I had never fully understood until that moment. There were some people who doubted us, questioned our story, and tried to downplay what had happened. But my mom kept pushing forward. She spoke at local community events, sharing our story, and reminding people that racism doesn't always come in the form of overt hatred. Sometimes it's the subtle acts of discrimination that go unnoticed until someone speaks up. And that's exactly what she did. She spoke up, and she encouraged others to do the same. It wasn't an easy path, but with every step I saw my mom growing stronger, and through that, I grew stronger too. I began to understand that there was more power in standing up for what's right than in staying silent. In the end, it wasn't about revenge or making the clerk or the store owner pay. It was about creating a ripple effect, about showing people that their voices mattered, that standing up for each other made us all stronger. As time passed, I found myself more and more involved in the process. My mom would bring me along to meetings with advocacy groups, to talks with other families who had experienced similar injustices. And even though it was hard, it was also empowering. We weren't alone. There were so many others fighting for the same thing: fairness, equality, and respect, and together we were making a difference. In the end, the store owner was forced to make significant changes. They implemented new policies, offered sensitivity training for employees, and even made a public apology to the community. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And for the first time in my life, I realized that standing up for what was right, no matter how hard it was, could make a difference. The whole experience changed me. It taught me the power of speaking up, of fighting for what's right, and of never letting anyone make me feel less than. And as I walked alongside my mom, knowing that she had helped lead the way, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride. But more than that, I felt empowered. I realized that I had a voice, and it was powerful. I could make a difference. My mom had shown me that. She had taught me that standing up for justice wasn't just an act of courage, it was an act of love. For myself, for others, and for a world that needed to be better. And together we had done just that. As I think back on everything that happened, I realize that this experience was not just about the racism we had encountered. It was about the strength, the resilience, and the unwavering belief that no matter how hard the world may seem, we can make it better, one voice at a time. And that's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life.